I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear the thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. The question we've been asking is there a connection between Nicola Bulley and Gaynor Lord? And now the question arises, is there a connection with a third woman, Clare Marshall, as well? We're going to deal with Nicola Bulley's mental state and some of the things that came out in the inquest. But first, I want to deal with Clare Marshall, a woman who went missing 10 days after Gaynor on December 18th, and also 3 days after Gaynor was found. It's still very early in the search for the 64-year-old woman from Scotland, but let's start with that first. So in the early hours of Monday morning, December 18th, just 2 days ago, 10 days after Gaynor disappeared, and as I say, on the third day after she was found, Gaynor was found somewhere around Friday morning, Friday midday, and Clare vanished first thing, basically, Monday morning, just after that weekend. Right now, search teams are combing the area again around a river, this time the River Tay, and nearby Moncrief Island. Marshall was dressed in all black clothing at the time of her disappearance. What happened was apparently Clare went for a walk in the early hours. We're not sure exactly when. It's quite strange that the timing of this is so unknown. Did she leave before or after dawn? We do know the alarm was raised at around lunchtime when she was still missing. Of these three women, the alarm was raised quite late in terms of Clare Marshall. Once again, we have a similar scenario. A woman seems to venture out intentionally, heads to or in the general direction of a river, and then disappears. Then you say, what is the connection between these three women in terms of these scenarios? And can I offer a potentially obvious answer to that? Isn't there a psychological connection? I mean, if the media are drawing connections, if I'm drawing connections, if there are these obvious connections, aren't these women themselves drawing psychological connections themselves as well? I live by a river. That woman reminds me of XYZ. Anyway, once again, we have a river, this time the Tay, with similar features to the Wire and the Yar, becoming tidal in the general area of the city where the victim is from, and the river then discharges into the sea. The River Tay means silent one or strong one. It's the longest river in Scotland and the largest river in the entire UK as measured by discharge, the amount of water flowing into the sea. It also has by far the largest catchment of UK rivers at around 2,000 square miles. It actually it arises in western Scotland and then flows all the way to the eastern coast. South Africa's Orange River is very similar. Now, if we are comparing this case to Gaynor Lord, it's hard to imagine Clare Marshall wasn't aware of it. It's hard to imagine Clare Marshall wasn't influenced by it. And the case I've been trying to make is, wasn't Gaynor influenced in some way by the Nicola Bulley case? Unlike Gaynor, who seemed to be dressed in brightly colored clothing, and this may have facilitated finding her, relatively quickly, although she was found with sonar, but her coat was found as well. But she disappeared in a river after dark. Well, Clare was dressed in dark clothing, like Nicola Bulley, and disappeared possibly close to or before dawn. This idea that she went for a walk wearing black clothing, I must say, kind of has an ominous ring to it. Wouldn't you want to wear visible clothing if you're walking around when it's not terribly light? There still is very little information on when she left home as of yet. No CCTV has been released of Clare Marshall. In addition, well, certainly at the time that I wrote this, no family, friends, or witnesses have come forward publicly. That has changed really in the last hour, where there has been a little bit of an appeal from desperate friends urging Clare to come home. So we are in day 2 of the search for Clare Marshall. It seems to be a massive search. They are using helicopters, a lot of people out there in the Dundee Road area of Perth in Scotland. In terms of any kind of foul play scenario, well, the area where Clare was walking can only be accessed by foot, so it's not as though a car could have been driving easily in the area. And the island where she seemed to be heading towards is covered by the King James, is it the 5th Golf Club? And you can't imagine anyone was playing golf very, very early in the morning, before the sun was up. Right now, police are scouring CCTV footage at the golf club and searching the course. Of course, it's going to be difficult to see someone at night who is wearing black, but obviously not impossible. The other thing that's important is Clare Marshall was not a member of this club, so she didn't really have a reason to be there. I'm not going to take it further than this in terms of Clare Marshall. From here on, we're going to be discussing Nicola Bulley's mental health. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're finding this analysis astute, useful, interesting, please like, share, leave a comment. I also want to thank those who've shared their feelings, their experiences in this sort of area. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So something that really bothered me, something that I was actually a little bit upset about during the inquest, were some of the statements made regarding Nicola, and basically that she'd had a blip. And a blip is kind of a temporary, no big deal, nothing to worry about situation, a blip in sales. A blip is also a small spot of light that appears on a radar screen. And I suppose you could say in terms of mental health, well, it's a blip, it's a small spot of darkness in someone's life. Is that really what we were talking about in Nicola Bulley's life? And I just don't like I'm someone who knows words quite well. I just don't like how that word seems to minimize and undermine Nicola Bulley's actual situation, because as we know, on January 10th, literally just almost 2 weeks before she died, her family summoned the authorities to come and check on her welfare. And she was actually intoxicated at the time. That was in mid-January. And the statement that her partner made was that she kind of had a setback over December, right? But that this was a temporary blip, that this was a blip, and then she was completely fine in January. And of course, how can you be completely fine? How can you say this at an inquest? How can you say this several months later in hindsight? How can you compare it to a blip, something that's temporary, when it comes back in January, that's middle of January, and then of course there's the incident that happens 2 weeks later. And I must say, to suggest that these things have got nothing to do with one another. In other words, the welfare check, which Nicola was apparently extremely angry about. She was extremely angry that law enforcement was summoned. I think she was embarrassed, she was humiliated, she just simply wasn't very happy about it. It certainly, I don't think, was a blip to her. I don't think she thought of it as a small deal. Now, I've gotten some very toxic, nasty, ugly comments in my chat, certainly regarding the Nicola Bulley case and my coverage of it. And I want to just say that in November, almost a month ago today, the Mail Online revealed that Nicola experiencing significant issues with alcohol. That's in the headline of a story. That's not me saying it or implying it or assuming it or inferring it. That is in the headline, that Nicola was experiencing significant issues with alcohol before she went missing. That statement was made by the family in advance and then cleared. In other words, they basically seem to be saying to law enforcement, please get the message out there. In other words, that she was a high-risk person, and this was the reason for the high risk. And there was outrage. There's this incredible indignation that you've revealed something very private about Nicola. And I think what the family were trying to do was show and demonstrate and try and get the public to see that the focus needs to be on finding Nicola and kind of that aspect of things, and not being preoccupied with rabbit holes or foul play and whatnot. But the important thing is that the family actually had this information, conveyed it to law enforcement, which then conveyed it to the public. And then law enforcement were blamed for this. And you can kind of get a feeling now that law enforcement are actually damned for telling the truth. And obviously it's understandable, because it seems like one is pointing a finger insensitively, unsympathetically towards Nicola and saying, well, victim blaming and all of that kind of thing. But it's actually not. It's simply trying to understand the process here. And I think it's quite important that the true crime community are aware of this, that certainly this channel, we try and figure out the process, the dynamics, the whole ecosystem of triggers and psychologies and the environmental factors and all the things that go into what leads to human behavior. It doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? And so we're trying to understand it from that perspective. We're not trying to judge it. We're not trying to condemn anyone. We're simply trying to, and this is whether a crime has been committed or a situation like this. We're simply trying to understand what happened. We don't want to be on someone's side, like, in, for example, the Ramsey case, are you on this side or that side? It's not about taking sides. If any one side, we're on the side of reality. That's what being authentic is all about. So it's not about taking sides, it's about figuring out what really happened. And I don't think there should be a bias against that. I don't think it's being insensitive trying to find out what really happened. Quite the opposite. It's being very sensitive just to the events of the case while being empathetic and aware and sensitive to the individual that this is related to. Does that make sense? Quoting from the Daily Mail, the bombshell revelation that Nicola Bulley had been experiencing significant issues with alcohol was cleared with her family in advance. References to a struggle with the menopause sparked allegations of victim blaming. These were made at the specific request of her relatives. It seems like her relatives said to law enforcement, please mention this aspect. The report says the move was avoidable and unnecessary, although not lawful. In other words, talking about this private aspect of Nicola was lawful. They didn't break the law, but could have been avoided. And I don't know whether that's the lesson to learn, is to say one shouldn't speak about things like that. Because isn't the question, why was this becoming such a big deal over Christmas? Well, over Christmas, there's this pressure to put up a brave face. There's this pressure, kind of a sustained pressure over kind of a long period, to be happy, to be merry, to be around family for an extended period, and have the sunny side up. And what if you're not feeling particularly sunny then? What if that pressure and anxiety is getting the best of you? What if you're feeling overwhelmed? When everyone's feeling happy and merry and kind of in a good mood and you not, how do you tell people that? Because you feel like you can't. As far as I'm concerned, one of the biggest revelations, the biggest piece of evidence that came out during Nicola's inquest had to do with her emotional state and specifically her anxiety. I'm quoting from what Paul Britton wrote about her inquest. In February 2022, at a HRT review, Nikki appeared emotional and said her anxiety had increased along with low mood. So by her own admission, Nikki was saying she was struggling with anxiety, and she was even on anti-anxiety medication. I think HRT stands for hormone replacement therapy. And so what the doctor did was he tweaked the level of estrogen in the medication. Nikki's next HRT review said she was struggling with her sleep and said that this was due to her work. Dr. Gray said she described how her brain felt like it was overloaded. These are her words. She said, "I'm feeling overloaded. My mind is overloaded. My thoughts are overloaded." And one way to try and calm, quell, silence that chatter, one might think, is to drink, right? And another way, obviously not a very constructive way, but a way that one might think about it is, if you talk about drowning one's sorrows, right? Well, you tend to think about it drinking, but what if someone is so compromised that they're thinking about it literally? According to the inquest on January 11, 2023, Nikki went to a walk-in center at Fleetwood and said she had fallen and banged her head the previous night and was feeling drowsy and had been sick, the inquest is told. This was one day after that kind of intervention. She was sent to A&E at Blackpool Victoria Infirmary, where a head CT scan found no internal injury. At one stage over Christmas in 2021, this was a year earlier for Nikki. It's 2 years earlier for us. But Nikki stopped taking her HRT medication because she felt it might be causing her low mood. And that is also a significant thing. A change in medication means that you're going to have a totally different mental state, a totally different adaptive response. It's a totally different situation. Apparently, Nikki restarted this medication, but this apparently didn't improve her hot flushes. So if it's true that Nicola restarted her medication again in January, this could explain something that may have aggravated how she was feeling. The banging of her head the previous night, January 10th, seems to be another aspect that is recorded but isn't explained. Something else I want to say that's kind of delicate, but I think it's important to say this is, if someone's friends and family, I'm talking about months later, are the kind of people who don't want to talk about mental illness or in denial, right? I'm talking about everything has already happened and it's months later. Then you can imagine Nicola would have been in too. If you're surrounded by people who don't really want to talk about this sort of thing, well, then the person who's suffering from it doesn't really want to either. Personally, I'm not sure if the right way to deal with it is to call the police, a paramedic, or a team to intervene, and then later to deny that there was ever any problem or to refer to it as a blip, but that's me. On the other hand, you might say, well, the police being called was because something extreme had happened after a pattern that they were struggling to deal with, but then again, you can't refer to it as a blip. It's not a temporary issue, it's a serious problem. And our heart certainly goes out to Nicola and to those around her, but you feel like she's in a situation where, for whatever reason, and it might not be anybody's fault whatsoever, not the health folk around her, not Nicola's fault, not her family. Some things are just very difficult. Some psychologies are sometimes just very difficult to untangle in a sense. Certain medical conditions are just intractable. And in that case, it is totally understandable in a sense to turn to alcohol because you just want some relief. But that's not necessarily going to improve the situation long term. But one can understand someone feeling that, while I'm at wit's end, let me just have a drink. Haven't we all felt that way? One of the biggest things that emerged in the inquest was this idea that there were screams, and if there were, that was a very strong indication that this was an accident. But bear in mind, Nicola wasn't intoxicated at the time. Unfortunately, if those screams fall away, if you think critically about this and you say, the time doesn't quite match, if the people remembered the time more accurately, or I'm just saying, if those screams fall away, then there are stronger indications that it wasn't an accident. And I think, although that's very hard to be absolutely clear about one way or the other, if you go into the dynamics and you go into what was taking place as a long process, where does that take you? To an accident or an accident waiting to happen? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.